działa.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my privilege and honor to be with you. Yuri has invited me to deliver a speech. I don't like the word keynote speech because it suggests that somehow I'm a little bit out of the general audience, and I consider myself as being one of you in terms of fighting for rights, and we had some moments when we could work and cooperate together when I was still in the civil society sector. But for the last 6 years I was serving as the Polish ombudsman. The official name is the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Republic of Poland. I was selected thanks to the effort of the coalition of Polish NGOs, and before I was working for the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. Right now, after finishing this job, I'm once again with the civil society, but mostly I deal with my academic staff, but I'm involved in a couple of different initiatives supporting in general civil society. But why I feel privileged? Because I think you are risking a lot in your daily activities, and you are really courageous in your actions. I have a feeling that still Poland is not that kind of a country that you are risking that much, except for some maybe not nice situation, pressure, hate speech, maybe some other methods of intimidation. I think the people who are risking a lot right now are in Poland independent prosecutors and judges, but also some civil society leaders who are very active in promotion of rights of those people who are especially vulnerable or marginalized. But why I also feel under a certain stress, because all of you represent different countries, different jurisdictions, and you have different experiences. So it is quite difficult to address in a general way such a diversified audience. But having said this, I would like to underline that the civil society perspective and the ombudsman perspective, especially in those difficult times in Poland, gives me some additional view on what was happening and on certain trends, certain methods of action. Please note, when I started my job, and when I was also working for the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, Poland was presented more or less as a model country. I remember all those times when I was traveling to different countries, to Ukraine, to Georgia, to Armenia, Azerbaijan, to Russia, and I was, to be honest, quite proud of my country, that we have managed to transform our economy into the market economy, that we are developing, that we have created a set of different rule of law institutions, and that this whole system works pretty well. Of course, we had some human rights violations, human rights abuses. I was especially involved into the case, I think in the most interesting case of that time, the CIA rendition case and the presence of the secret prison in the territory of Poland. But even if you add all those problems and cases, they were not of that nature to undermine the general, more or less, success story. And I was believing at that time very much that we are just reform our country in a very organic, organized way, so that with every year we'll be able to repair the situation in the country, and then sooner or later our standards will be similar as those, let's say, in Scandinavian countries, maybe Netherlands, maybe Germany. So those traditional, typical states that basically are democratic and protect rights and freedoms. But in fact, 2015 was a very much turning year in Polish history, but also in my imagination, because Jarosław Kaczyński, the leader of the Land Justice Party, following the Hungarian example, started anti-democratic changes. And the first stage was dismantling the independence of the Constitutional Court, so basically disabling the method of judicial review of a legislation. And it happened as a result also of a series of legislative acts, but also violation of a constitution. And later on, basically, all different changes succeeded in terms of controlling the prosecutor's office, secret services, public media, but also in terms of attack on independent judiciary. And some people ask this question: okay, so how is it possible? How is it? How it could happen that Poland, being the success story, could end up as a so problematic country? And I think my service during those almost 1 years give a lot of reflection on why the kind of changes were possible. And I think that there are like two major answers. First answer is such that we have installed and created institutions, but we didn't convince people why they need them, those institutions. So the level of civic education, legal awareness, legal culture was extremely weak, in fact. If it was possible for new leaders to destroy them so quickly or to undermine their position. The second reason was this so-called politics of identity, so presentation of the ruling party as the one who is representing the true majority of a nation. And if you present yourself in this way, a little bit like Donald Trump did, then you have much more freedom to attack minorities, attack different groups that are not that do not constitute majority, that are marginalized, that are vulnerable, but also you have more freedom to attack elites. And why is it possible to attack elites, especially including judges? Because there is a low level of legal culture and lack of sufficient understanding why judges are really needed, and the division of powers is a fundamental principle in a democratic society. And please note that that kind of a trend in Poland was similar as the one in Hungary. So the so-called salami tactics, cutting slices of independent institutions, has been implemented. But this trend was also repeated, maybe not repeated, but it is underway in Slovenia slowly. So we see that Polish example is not just an exceptional one, but it is like a larger authoritarian trend. And moreover, this Polish example is having impact on the whole European Union, and right now we have a huge discussion about non-enforcement of judgments of the Court of Justice of the European Union, and even some attempt to undermine the credibility of the European Union as the political organization. So I know that those authoritarian trends and national populism trends are not present only in the European Union member states, but also in other parts of the world. I know that some countries are simply authoritarian, and then there is no discussion about any protection of rights, but rather how to at least limit number of violations of rights, how to release political prisoners, how to not allow the state to kill its own citizens. It is a completely different discussion. I will reflect on this, but on the other hand, I don't feel that I'm competent enough to talk seriously about this challenge and about this difficult situation. But let me just spend a few moments on some more general trends I see. Because when we are talking about human rights, and especially in this capacity, we should take into account some geopolitical trends. I think one important trend happening right now is the situation in the United States, and especially it has impact. It should have huge impact on the OSCE. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is regarded as one of the greatest advancers of the multilateralism in international relations. And if there is OSCE as one of those international organizations, and the United States is a part of it, and especially after this time when it was not supported so heavily, and also United Nations was not supported so heavily by the United States, I think it gives us a chance for this once again promotion of democracy and rule of law and human rights. And it seems to me that we cannot escape this, but the United States should be the major player in this global game. Second, we see that the European Union is on the one hand suffering because of problems with Poland and Hungary, but on the other hand, the European Union is also strengthening its own instruments of rule of law and human rights, and is becoming more and more active player also. Maybe not globally, but locally, also with the use of the European Endowment for Democracy, but also internally, the newly established Values Fund might have a certain impact on democratic standards. But in my opinion, what is needed is like a stronger cooperation just between the United States and the European Union in the fight for values. Because so after this Trumpian era, I think we should come back to this real Euro-Atlantic alliance around Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And it seems to me that despite all those different problems, it seems to me that the US administration understands this cause. And also taking into account geopolitical situation, we need to find responses and be active in not just dealing with daily issues, but also with those affecting current and future generations, artificial intelligence and climate change being one of the most important problems. And irrespectively of the situation in different states, we have to address this because, first of all, it is important to younger generations, and younger generations do not understand, for example, fight for the rule of law because the climate change is the most important for them. And I can only agree with it, but also in order to broaden the basis for the support, to broaden the basis for this individual reflection on rights and on the individual involvement. I guess it's done? Okay. So what else could be done? I think we need to strengthen international organizations. Some of them have a lot of capabilities to act, but they don't use it because of different political measures. And in my opinion, it is especially the role of those traditional members of those organizations that have money and resources. Look at the European Court of Human Rights, which is issuing quite many judgments, but has a budget lower, I think, 7 or 8 times than the Court of Justice in the European Union. So that is just one very specific example. So the budget constraints is a major limit in the operation of this organization. Or look, for example, at the special rapporteurs in the United Nations that do not have even separate budget for their operation. So I think pressure on strengthening international organizations as a response mechanism is important because, in fact, Polish state is not a good example of responding to recommendations, but I can imagine that there are a number of countries that, because of their size, location, political dimension of changes, they may be much more responsive to different recommendations of international organizations. I think that we should do more in order to work together between different organizations coming from different states on certain human rights material issues. I think that we are so much concentrated sometimes on our daily national problems that we do not invest enough time into international cooperation, coordination of efforts, or just even sharing good practices. I think we should take a good lesson out of those non-democratic practices. Like, for example, I really see how important right now the civic education is, and that we took as granted that if we implement some basic values of the liberal democracy, then the society will understand it. It will not, if we will not teach, if we will not spend enough time on this. And also, we should try to think how to spread the word about human rights to those people who are not just following the traditional discussion on civil and political rights, but for example, on those rights that affect some larger parts of society. Sometimes we need to find ways that are completely strange, non-typical. Danuta Przywara is very well known to you. Is right now on on the bus, we have one NGO leader, Robert Hojdas, has created a new initiative which is called Tour de Konstytucja, and he's just driving with the specific minibus all around the Poland, just to organize in smaller cities meetings about the value of the constitution and constitutional rights. Donda Przywaga is right now with him going to some small cities in western Poland. But this initiative has been implemented with a really limited resources, and over the last couple of months, Mr. Hojda has visited approximately 100 Polish cities when some specific discussions on rights were organized. I just present this as one of examples of actions, such actions that are getting out of the box of a traditional discourse on rights. And certainly, we should do a lot in order to support civil society, but also I think we should support those who are key actors of the liberal democracy, I mean judges. So the principle of judicial independence and protecting judges, because judges will not defend themselves, they usually do not have a machinery to do it, is a really important component. As a final point, going to an end, I would like to say that I have learned that there are certain mechanisms of power that could be used in countries moving from democracy to some kind of hybrid democracy, non-consolidated democracy, competitive authoritarian system. You can use all different names from political science. And I would just like to share with you just 3 of those practices, because I think they are important sometimes to understand how certain things are done, especially in the contemporary world. So the first method, in my opinion, is the method of so-called discriminatory legalism. It is a method in which you are simply using the law, but in order to address your enemies. So you are silent, you are not following the law when it comes to your friends, to your affiliates, to your social groups that support you, but you are targeting with the law and you are using the law intensively when you are the enemy. And I think each of us may enumerate examples of this, that we feel that something is wrong, that on surface it looks legal, it looks as being compliant with the legal formalities, but underneath you see that there is a problem because some people escape the law and some are attacked with the law. The second phenomenon is use of economic power of the state to curtail freedom, but also to shrink the space for civil society and in consequence to support those who are friends of the government. I know that Gongos is a very typical example of this, but I think it goes further. It goes into manipulation in social media. It goes into sometimes privatization of coercive measures, so paying those who are doing certain things which cannot be exploited on behalf of the state, but basically they are exploited by some far-right organizations. It is also about purchasing media, so limiting the space for discussion as a result of purchasing of media directly by the government or by the governmental affiliates. And the third phenomenon I would like to mention is a new method of governmental propaganda. So look at this, when this Moscow mechanism has been adopted, the problem was that dissidents couldn't speak. They couldn't raise their voice because they didn't have access to information. They have been censored. They didn't have any channels of communication. Right now, usually, they have a right to talk. They have all different possibilities. But the problem is that the government is creating 10 alternatives to this speech. 10 different kinds of fake news or misinformation, and a citizen cannot get what is the truth at the end of the day. He, she cannot find what is really the truthful account of certain events or of certain situations. So this manipulation with information is completely different by multiplying the flow of information and by creating that everything is vibrant and everything is not stable in terms of finding out what is the truth. And there is a very good proof of this by Anne Applebaum, Twilight of Democracy, and she names it that we are living in something like a cacophony of information, cascades of information. And please note the contemporary governments, they know well not just to use the governmental propaganda, but just how to manipulate with the information. And in my opinion, we need to understand those processes because it is our role to explain them to the people. Just to find a new methodology also of talking about this discriminatory legalism, shrinking space, and using economic power, as well as these new methods of governmental propaganda, because it is much more difficult to protect rights in this environment. As a last point, I would like to say that with respect to those countries that are simply authoritarian, the challenge is much more different, and it is the challenge for whole Europe, for the whole world, how to show solidarity and how to make pressure in an effective way. And to be honest, I don't know the answer to this, but I think this issue should be discussed. Why different measures of solidarity and different measures of pressure are not so effective as they were maybe in previous years. And also, maybe it is also about learning people that measures of solidarity are sometimes not just to achieve a certain result, but it is a question of our personal moral obligation. So the fulfillment is in our own morality, that we show solidarity, and not in this that somebody else will, that this measure will lead towards a specific result. So I think that the deeper reflection on the value of solidarity in a contemporary world with respect to political dissidents, political prisoners, and other people subject of repression is extremely important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please stay here for a bit in the focus. Anyone has questions, remarks? I don't see any hands. Oh, yes. Okay, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hugh Williamson. I work at Human Rights Watch. Thanks so much to the organisers of the conference. I really enjoyed your speech, Mr. Bodnar. I was also taken by your 3 points looking forward. Could you elaborate on those a little bit about how you think we should integrate those points, the Applebaum point, the civil society point, the use of legal work of human rights organisations, or indeed of OSCE participating states? What should the lessons be from your forward-looking points? Thanks so much.
I think that the major lesson could be such that we can use different, because all those issues are described in the political sciences literature, so there is no doubt about it. And to be honest, maybe I will share my practice. I'm a lawyer, and it took me some time to find answers to some problems that started to happen in Poland, and to explain to myself those problems with the use of that kind of a terminology. Because usually, when you are a lawyer, then you are following judgments, you are concentrating on enforcement, on compliance, non-compliance. So you are just going in a very traditional way, and because you do not have this methodological account of certain things, using knowledge from other sciences, you have a certain difficulty in finding like the bigger picture of this. So so I think that one idea is that maybe that kind of a narrative and theories from political sciences should be more integrated into a typical human rights law. And second, I think it is important to involve those theories into the simply human rights training, because at a certain point we need to tell to people with whom we work what is really happening, why this search and seizure in an office of the NGO is not just an example of a violation of the freedom of association and Article 11 of the Convention, and that will go with this to the European Court of Human Rights or to some other place, but simply we have to say, okay, it is one of the elements of building the system of competitive authoritarianism, according to a theory by Stephen Levitsky and Liu Kan-wei. And it seems to me that those theories allow us to put everything in a much more dynamic way, to see certain, not just individual facts, but certain processes happening in particular societies. And also, it seems that they are quite important. I think some part of you at least have contacts with embassies that are trying to understand the situation on the ground. So sometimes, like using that kind of theories gives you some opportunity to present domestic situation not just as a set of some isolated events and happenings, but also as something like a bigger trend that is happening in a society. So that's how I see it.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. We appreciate your reflections.
I still have a question, by the way.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. I have a question to Adam. So
yes,
well, after you speak, yeah.
Well, we have just over 2 months left before Poland assumes the OSCE chairpersonship. This organization, the Civic Solidarity Platform, actually that organizes this conference, actually was established, or incepted rather, in 2010 when Kazakhstan assumed the chairpersonship of the OSCE, and we heavily criticized this decision, saying that a chair country should lead by example, and Kazakhstan was not fit with that, or at least should dramatically improve its record during the chairpersonship year. So my question to you is whether would you have any advice to Polish civil society and larger international civil society on how do we put, well, pressure is not the right word, but rather encourage or name and shame or somehow influence the Polish authorities in the light of its incoming chairpersonship of the OSCE, so that it indeed understands that leading by example is essential. It's not just a technical role. Thank you.
Thanks.
I treat that question by Yuri more as not as a question, but more as a task for maybe myself and other people in Poland. It's true that Poland is assuming chairmanship. Quite interestingly, it was even used. This argument was used in the first speech by Mr. President Andrzej Duda when he took the presidency last year, that it will be like a big challenge for Poland to succeed. Personally, I was using this argument in the context of some informal discussions with representatives of international organizations when the ombudsman, when I was going to be kicked out from the office of the ombudsman. Maybe some of you know that I couldn't finish my term properly. Oh, maybe it's more complicated. I finished this term properly, but then I was working as the interim ombudsman until the election of the new person. But in between, the Constitutional Court issued a judgment saying that I cannot be this interim ombudsman. So basically, I had to resign without waiting for the new person to come into my shoes. But fortunately, somebody has, I think, in the ruling party has realized that maybe it goes too far, and so finally the compromise candidate has been found, so only this moment when there was no ombudsman was just 2 weeks, so not that bad. And the new one is pretty good one, so at least he has kept all my deputies, which is a good thing. Okay, but answering to your question, I think simply it is our task, as civil society, to meet and to discuss what we can do and how we can use this opportunity, in fact, to put a pressure on the government. I think it didn't happen, at least maybe I'm not aware of some actions. Maybe because we are so much overstretched in our energy and activities with all those daily problems that sometimes it is difficult to find time for more strategic thinking. So the rule of law and repressions against judges are really important, against prosecutors, against LGBT plus community. Right now we have this difficult situation on the border. But you are right that maybe, unfortunately, we should come back to this Kazakhstan example and say that we are pretty much the same right now in terms of creating some methods of control. So thank you very much for invitation and for this question, because as I said, I assume it is a kind of a task for myself to be more oriented into this. Thank you.
I know that Yuri has another announcement a bit later, but before that, I told you it's not going to be easy from the beginning. Let me play Fox News to your CNN. You mentioned the United States and your big hopes for the Biden administration. To me, it sounded a bit like an op-ed from the New York Times around about October last year. We're in October 2021 today. By now we know that the Biden administration refused to sanction Nord Stream 2. Biden invited Putin to Geneva without meeting President Zelensky before that. Basically now, Victoria Nuland was in Moscow to discuss extensively Russian-American cooperation on Afghanistan. And of course there's a big China issue, which seems to consume already a third consecutive administration, starting with Obama. So probably hopes are completely groundless. There is geopolitics, and basically Russia and Belarus issue, and Ukraine for that matter, that representative of Ukraine here, we shouldn't forget about it, are actually parked by the US administration, which finds itself more on the kind of talking than doing side.
Okay, so maybe I will start with Nord Stream 2 issue. I think that, of course, this decision was wrong, and anybody in Poland will say the same. But I think that at the same time, I see that Polish problems within the European Union, and especially with the Court of Justice, are also affecting Nord Stream 2, because the only solution, in my opinion, that would give a chance for let's say modification how to use this mechanism is the principle of the energy solidarity within the European Union, and this principle could be achieved only via legislation at the EU level and the Court of Justice of the European Union. So I think that is why I claim that Poland should be a strong member of the European Union, because thanks to this we can achieve also some of our purposes, and in this regard not only Polish energy security but also Ukrainian energy security is extremely important element of this discussion. With respect, of course, I'm following. I'm not naive. I follow the international politics, and I follow what happened in Afghanistan. But on the other hand, we should have a comparison between the previous administration and the new administration. And the previous administration was almost, previous US administration was almost deinstalling any real involvement of the United States into multilateral organizations. And United States declares an appointment of Blinken, and right now also Karen Donfried for European affairs, suggests that the cooperation within multilateral organizations is treated seriously. And simply, it seems to me that if we think about those big geopolitical blocks, we don't have any other solution to pay this debt. Then maybe this solution is not perfect, maybe it's not the best one, and it was not by mistake that I have mentioned the CIA rendition case, which was heavily detrimental to the Polish reputation and obviously to human it seems to me that there is no alternative than this cooperation at the geopolitical level, but simply we should expect more from the United States in terms of not just going into geopolitical dimension of discussions, but also more reliance on those values that Biden was promised to keep up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we do not have much time to continue, although it was a fascinating discussion. Please thank Bodnar for and